Good morning, everyone, and to the ones that may be on the East Coast, good afternoon. Good. All right. Welcome to this month's edition of Oak Hill Regional Community Development Corporation's third Wednesday Parent Resource Chat. As you know, my name is Thomas Robertson, and usually Miss Bettina Campbell fills in. I mean, she's the host for our third Parent Resource Chats, but I'm filling in for her today. My name is Duke. Well, my real name is Thomas Robertson. I am the Technology and Metrics Director for Oak Hill Regional Community Development Corporation, which is the parent corporation of Healthy Kids Mississippi. I will be your moderator today. We also have with us this morning Mrs. Lottie Miner, who serves as the Project Director for Oak Hill Regional CDC, and many navigators and assisters. We recognize our board chair, Jennifer Garrett, and our executive director, Dr. Michael O'Miner. In addition to this Zoomcast, we are restreaming today's webinar on our Oak Hill Regional CDC and Mississippi Facebook pages. So please feel free to share on your social media pages. May is Minority Health Month, Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. So today we have with us our friend, more aware we need to do work can help them to thrive and survive. Also, he will share some resources with us. However, in case we have some new listeners, just a bit about Dr. Vereen. He is currently the director of the University of Michigan Substance Abuse Research Center. Dr. Vereen is a public health psychiatrist who directs community-based research activities and public health research in such areas as drug abuse, addiction, mental health, violence, and HIV and AIDS at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Dr. Vereen is a former medical officer and special assistant for NIDA, NIMH, National Institutes of Health, and former deputy drug czar, Office of National Drug Control Policy for the White House. Dr. Vereen earned an A.B. degree from Harvard College, an M.D. from Tufts University School of Medicine, and an MPH from Harvard School of Public Health. Before we get started and Dr. Vereen takes over, I want to encourage you to please make sure that you share this on your social media platform. You can go visit the website, our Facebook, healthykidsms.org, or our Facebook, Oak Hill Regional CDC. Then make sure you have your paper and your pencil ready to write down any questions or concerns you may have. We will try our best to get to those questions at the end of Dr. Vereen's presentation. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Vereen. I'm excited to hear what you will have to share with us today. It is in your hands.
Well, good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, wonderful. I'm really excited to be here, and I have to make a couple of disclosures. The first is that Mrs. Bettina Campbell twisted my arm. She really forced me to come here. And of course, you know that that's not true. When she called and said, could you pull some things together that would be helpful, I really look forward to the chance to be here again. And as part of a disclosure, I try to make it clear what my most important credentials are. And the first is that I'm a dad. I'm the father of, well, there are 2 grown children. They're 29 and 26. But I'm also a husband. I'm a son. I am a brother. I'm a brother-in-law. And all of those things are important. I know I'm being asked to come here as an expert, but I want you to know that the expertise is seasoned, if you will, with what there is in real life. So I'm going to show you some slides that may look pretty technical, but it's all in the service of helping us understand better adolescent mental health. And so with that, I'm going to go through a lot of information quickly so we can maximize our time to have questions and comments and discuss. And if we don't get through everything, I've been assured we can come back and refocus on certain things or talk about topics that are related to this. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Allow the Zoom to see your screen. There we go. But I've got I can't see on my screen yet what it is I need to, there we go.
Dr. Vereen, this is Lottie Minor.
Hi, how are you?
Good morning. I apologize for my tardiness. Good morning, everyone.
No,
good morning. Good morning. Dr. Vereen,
Good morning.
we're so happy to
I
have
have on
you here
here to
with
say
us.
a quick hello to you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Glad that you're here. Apologize for my technical difficulties, but I am present. So glad that you are with us. And I know that you probably have been properly introduced. We already know you because you've been with us so much. But before you start going through your slides, I want to say, I heard what you said a moment ago about expertise being seasoned. And I think we are so blessed to have you with us and blessed that you have that seasoning. From life experience and then also just your professional expertise. And we certainly thank all of our team for putting this together so that you could join us today. So I'm not going to take up your time. I want to hear what you have to say about adolescent mental health.
It's a deal, and I'm going to take what you just said a little bit as a challenge, because I would welcome any pushback on some of the things that you've heard, because if they don't quite sit well, that is totally okay. That's partly how we learn. And the other thing that's part of my full disclosure that I didn't mention is that when I'm giving a presentation, a part of my goal is to learn from the group that I'm interacting with. So
Certainly.
if I don't learn anything today through your questions or anything, then I haven't done a good enough job in the presentation and interacting with you.
Certainly.
So what I'm going to start off with is just a couple of comments about what Mrs. Campbell asked me to talk about, and then tell you what I'm going to share with you. So adolescent mental health, it's such an important topic. I'll point out that we're talking about this today in 2023. This was not a topic that we were talking about 50 years ago. We could have been, should have been. We knew that, you know, our young people were going through some tough times because the whole country, our parents were going through a tough time in the early 60s. I would argue that they're just as different now, and that context is very important as we think about our adolescents, our young people, our future adults, our future colleagues, our future grown children, and mental health as opposed to mental illness. And when we're talking about the two of them together, we have a very, very challenging topic. So what I'm going to do is just split the two for a second, for a couple of minutes, so that I can share some information that you might not be aware of, or that you may not have thought about. And then I'm going to present some different frames on how to think about adolescence, how to think about mental health, and maybe towards the end practice using some of what we've learned or been reminded of, and then how to practice how to think about it in a somewhat a different way. Let's begin with this idea about mental health. Mental health begins before conception. Now, you see that I put a brain in the background of my presentation here. That's because it's really important not to forget about biology, but our brains is what allows us, our brains are what allow us to act, behave, to feel wonderful about life, to contribute to our communities. But it is also the locus, it's also the focus of mental illness. And it's the brain that we're going to work through to maximize mental health. So before conception, if you have a healthy, that's mentally and physically, mom and dad, you're much more likely to be born mentally healthy. If mom or dad use drugs, which affects people's biology, including the eggs that are made in the ovary and the sperm made in the testicles, that can affect the forming young person. And I just want to make the point, mental health begins there. I can go into all kinds of other details. The circumstances under which a child is brought into the world in the midst of the civil rights arena that we were going through, the Black Lives Matter time that we're going through now, those contexts have an effect on our mental health. The context, as well as what's inside of us, are important, and we can't just pick one or the other and talk about mental health. They go together. And one thing to think about when you bring the context and the biology together, think about stress. The outside world can stress you to death, and you can generate your own stress. And we feel that stress because of our biology. And so that's just kind of an acknowledgement of those things. Now, again, I'm going to repeat, we're going to go through and I'm going to share some knowledge with you. And then I'm also going to introduce some ways to critically think about these things, or critically think about our already ingrained notions about what and who adolescents are and what mental health is. Let me first begin by saying mental health involves so many different things, as is indicated on this slide. But mental health is something that we experience. And in public health, we study the factors that put us at risk for experiencing a disease or an illness. So if we look at mental health and then focus on mental illness, there are all kinds of factors, risk factors, that are associated with increasing your chances of experiencing a mental illness. There's a list. At one point, there were, depending on how you counted them, there were 90 plus risk factors. One of the things that we've learned, and one of the things I want you to be thinking about, is that we're all at risk for various different reasons, but there are levels of risk. There are risks that are inherent in our community, risks in our families and peer groups. And then there are risks that we have individually. So we may be genetically predisposed to depression. You've heard about depression and manic depressive illness running in families. Well, if that's true, if there's a genetic set of risk factors that a young person inherits, they're going to see those genetic possibilities show up very early in their lives. One of the most important points, in case you were not aware, all major psychiatric illnesses develop, and you probably will see them very clearly before a person becomes an adult. You see the signs of schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, depression in young people or their early adulthood years. And that's why adolescent mental health is so important, because if you're aware of that information, you'll know to look for it. Now, we're not taught that, but I'm telling you, most mental illnesses will show up well before the person is 25, when they're still adolescents. And by the way, the definition of adolescent seems to be extending out. You know, we look at our children and it seems like they don't grow up completely until they're in their 30s. One of the definitions of adolescence adds or includes financial independence. And given the economics of our lives today, it's difficult for our children to be out there and economically independent. And so I think it's not unusual for some of us to be, you know, helping out our kids, even if they have young families, helping out the young families well into these folks are in their 30s. And we're going to skip over this. It's just another talk about risk factors. I want to raise the idea that if we're going to talk about risk factors, which are almost always negative, there's another side to the equation that's important, and those are protective factors. We've learned from research, and we've learned by observing very stressed and distressed communities. And some of those are communities, are our communities, our African-American communities, that people suffer from the conditions. They have bad outcomes from the conditions that they're in, but apparently not at the rate that you would expect. That they're, despite what people say and what the the caricature of a Black family, the caricature says Black families are dysfunctional. Well, that's not true. People try to hang together and do hang together and support each other very well despite terrible conditions. And there is research that, in my opinion, proves that bonds with families, hanging on to cultural values, African American cultural values, sticking with the school system, as challenged as it is, sticking with academics, and skill gaining for future work, all make a positive difference. Our children have talents. They may not be talents that we're familiar with. I have a daughter who went into business. That was not my thing. I wanted to go into medicine. I married a person who wanted to be an expert in economics. And we have a daughter who works for a Fortune 500 company and a son who is an artist who, before he could speak, was totally into dance. And as a result, one of the most intense athletes I have ever seen. And he has channeled all of those gifts, those God-given gifts, into his art, and is trying to make a life for himself through that art and through teaching. And so with that point, let me just offer a couple of quick thoughts, and then we're going to stop for some questions and some comments. I want you to grasp the idea, if you're not aware yet, that the brains of our children do not finish forming until they're in their mid-20s. The brains, our human brains, Black brains, Asian brains, white brains, Native American brains, human brains do not finish forming until the mid-20s. In this slide, you'll see these different colored splotches. Those are important pathways and areas of the brain that have not finished forming by age 18. And if you notice, most of them are purple, and those are in the frontal lobes, the part of the brain that we use to reason and make judgments. And so that's an important fact. When kids are distressed, like any human being, they will try to self-fix themselves. They'll when they're feeling weird or feeling bad, they will try to do something to help make themselves feel better. The most common thing, and the thing we've studied the most, is kids will take drugs, they will do things, engage in behaviors that will make them feel better. If they're feeling depressed, it's very common for them to take a drug to feel better. We know that because we as adults do that. We might have an extra drink or two. We'll eat to feel better. So there are all these things, and I don't want you to forget, they have biological consequences. If you eat too much, you'll become overweight. If you use drugs too much, you'll have some problems with your brain, and you may become addicted, and that will affect the rest of your body as well. This self-medication thing is important because when we talk about adolescent mental health, we're concerned about the behaviors we see. We're concerned about the suicide. We're concerned about homicides. Kids have access to guns now that they didn't 50 years ago. And if you've got access to a gun and you have a fleeting moment of hopelessness and that gun is right there, you will self-medicate with that gun. You will self-medicate with drugs. Tobacco is in the community. Tobacco is a great anxiolytic. It can calm you down. It also makes you a little sharper if you want to be able to do your work, and it's not as dangerous as cocaine, which certainly does that as well. But I want to show you and to make this very important but complicated point. We've been able to use research to study the use of drugs. What you're seeing here is a graph of the use of drugs by 12th graders. These are adolescent young people using drugs, and this is the whole country. And if you notice, there are times in our history when there's lots of drug use, and there are times when drug use goes down. This picture of drug use is a proxy for self-medication. When you ask young people, Black, white, Asian, otherwise, they will tell you that the majority of the reasons why they do drugs is to feel better. Sometimes they're staving off schizophrenia. Sometimes they're staving off depression. But what I want to show you in the next slide, when I was asked to present this information and the conclusions that it led to, I wasn't sure that what I was seeing here worked in the African American community. African American young people, in my experience, tended not to use drugs. And it was unclear what their reasoning was because we didn't do specific studies on African Americans to see what their reasoning for using drugs was, except that stress was a prime pusher of drugs. But stress for African American kids, they told us the stress increased exponentially after kids left school and left home. If you're an African American kid who went to an African American school, your stress level did not go up until you entered the real world, the so-called real world, less protected world. And what we see here is that same data where we've separated out the three main racial and ethnic groups in the United States. And what you will see, and this is what we didn't know, is that for self-medication, the self-medication hypothesis for using drugs was less relevant for African Americans until more recently. I'm sorry, I pulled out an old slide, but I have data, official data that this graph is based on. I have official data that goes up to 2019. Those are the last year that's available of official data from this study. I have the unofficial data because this study, believe it or not, is done here at the University of Michigan for the whole country. And what you'll see is that African American children have ups and downs in their self-medication use. But you notice that in the last 10 to 15 years, all adolescents seem to be converging together. They're not as separated as they were before. There's something happening in all of the different contexts, you know, where these kids are experiencing stress, they're experiencing mental illness, and their access to ways to self-soothe themselves is changing. And that's a part of what we're seeing here. So 2 takeaway points, and then we're going to open for a discussion and questions. Is the first is that the context in which people aren't feeling good where their mental health is threatened, the context in which mental health improves or doesn't or gets worse changes over time. We have to constantly be aware of that. And what kids are experiencing and the generation that they're in, Generation X versus Y or Z versus millennials, all of that is important as well. We as parents need to stay on top of those contextual things because it puts us in a better position to talk with our kids. So that kind of information is important. The other kind of information that's important is what is happening with our kids and their brains. If you're aware of that, your approach to them will be a little different. You will have no choice but to respect who they are and who they're becoming if you understand what's happening biologically. Now, I have a lot more slides that talk about the details of what's going on in a kid's brain. But until the mid-20s, if you as a parent are aware that your adolescent is very vulnerable to mental illness and that connecting with them and staying connected with them will be the most important way to support their mental health. And the things that you will want to be able to talk about and anticipate, which is what good parents are always trying to do, is based in keeping yourselves as informed as possible about what's going on in the environment and what's going on inside of our vulnerable adolescents. So let me end there and take any comments or questions.
Dr. Vereen, that was absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much. I love the fact that you brought up the context. You mentioned the context in which mental health changes, because sometimes we're just living life and we don't
Amen.
realize that those life changes bring about mental health changes, not only for the adolescent, but even for us as adults.
Amen.
One question that I have, and I'm sure that we have others, but we talk a lot about food insecurity. I think that started to get that conversation got heavier during the pandemic.
Yes.
And it continues. I think every summer it becomes in the forefront of our minds as children are no longer in school getting the meals. I think it should be in the forefront year round, but that's neither here nor there. But talk to me about how nutrition, if that is one of the things that play into mental health changes with our young folk. I think about the number of Head Start parents who watch this video, either who are watching now or may watch it later, and members of our team here at Oak Hill Regional CDC who work for Head Start, and they on a daily basis deal with those children, and they see hungry children every day, and they come in and they meet that need while school is in session. So
excellent question, and it gives me a chance to reinforce these not only buckets of information, but how to think about what's going on. First of all, you and I and everyone knows a hungry child is not in a position to be learning nothing.
Right.
They can't. Their brain cells are being starved because there is not enough glucose going to those brain cells so they can learn. Because that's why they're in school. They're supposed to learn certain things that will help them later in life. And those things relate to manipulating numbers, being able to decode words so you can read the Bible. And school is also important in teaching kids social skills because there are certain rules that you have to live by. Well, your brain is figuring out, oh, I better sit still. And that's not because the teacher's gonna whack me, although teachers don't whack students anymore. They
Yeah.
realize that the things that they want to be able to do in school, they can't do if they don't follow the rules. That's true in life. You're going to have a tougher time in life unless you follow the established rules from our society, our local society, and our culture. And you learn those things in school. So there's a biology issue there, and that's why we should be thinking about that first. It's just so basic. I said earlier that mental health begins before conception. If mom and dad are not well nourished, the babies that result are not going to be well nourished to begin with. The second thing I want to say about food insecurity and nutrition, and I don't want us to forget this, what happens around the dinner table is just as important as the nutrients that are going in the mouth, in the stomach, through the liver, out into the body, to the brain and the muscles. Just as important is that the love, the caring, the wisdom, the discussions, the disagreements that happen over the mealtime when, doesn't happen for all of us all the time because people have jobs with different hours and things, but certainly on Sundays, if folks aren't working, you come together for that meal, and that is just as important as the nutrition.
Wow.
So what we have to do is be deliberate about these things. That's why the whole topic of food insecurity, it's not just a topic for liberals to be talking about and saying, oh yeah, see, there's food insecurity over there. We need to raise some money and go. No, it's more than that. It's people aren't getting enough nutrition. Their lives, their physical lives are at risk. And the kids are even more vulnerable than the parents, than the adults. And then we need to be deliberate about, okay, in school, when you're getting the food, we need to be clear that every kid gets it. And we need to pay attention to the stigma of, oh, well, some kids are getting it and others aren't. No, we need to be deliberate about what's important here. It's the nutrition, and it's also what goes along with that. In our society, we put something with that nutritional set of exercises, we call a meal.
Wow.
There's some social things that go on as well that I would argue are just as important.
Wonderful.
I can give a separate discussion about nutrition because there are some very important points to be made there, but I'm sure everyone gets the importance of the biological, physical importance of nutrition.
Wow, that is phenomenal. Yeah, that's so true. I've even seen adults, I think, who suffer from the same thing. If they're a little hungry at work, the functioning is not going to be there.
Especially the boys.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because we're not as good with handling our feelings as girls.
And you mentioned the dinner table. I think that's a factor, because does the dinner table really exist? I would say on any day other than Sundays. I don't know if it really happens in some houses on Sundays, but you find people with busy schedules, even our children who participate in all these different activities that certainly have their place. I think sometimes we go too far with the activities, but
Amen.
Everybody's on a different schedule. Do families sit down and eat? I think that plays a lot with mental health, because as you said, that's going to give them an opportunity to talk. But if that sit down meal never ever happens, and I'm not saying it has to happen every night, because life is different from how it was in 1973 or 1963 or 1953, but at least a couple of times a week, everybody at the same table without this thing in their hand, but actually
Yep.
talking to each other to help talk about what's going on up here. I
And
think
that gives you an opportunity for parents to
parents.
figure out, because you know now that mental illness is much more likely to show up if it's going to happen before 25. It gives parents to say, how are you doing? Now, the kids, I will tell you, this is to follow up on your point, they're not going to be the most talkative. So let me offer this. Refrain from asking, how was your day in school today?
That's so
Because they'll
cliche.
just say, oh, it was fine. They're not going to give you an answer. It may take too much work. I mean, just I'm not giving them an excuse for not answering you, but it may be too big a question for them. So what I learned from my kids was I said, well, what happened? And then my kids would say, oh yeah, there was a fight or this happened. I said, well, are you okay with it? Yeah. And then one day my daughter said, otherwise it was the same boring day. So what I did in the future was I said, so, okay, so how boring was school today?
Wow.
And she said, well, actually, it wasn't that boring because what I learned in African American history, and it was always the African American history class that gave her a bump. And I thought, oh, okay, because some people had trouble with the teacher. And she wasn't always the most organized, but you know what? She got the kids' attention. And our daughter, so if the day was a 2, I just skipped the question. But if it was really, really boring, then I would ask, well, how did it make you feel? And that's when parents get a chance to say, oh, so you were feeling kind of low today. Okay, when I'm low, I listen to music. And you're meeting the kid halfway. I think it's really important. This is a point I wanted to make and didn't have a chance earlier. When we're interacting with our kids, we must listen. We must listen to what they say. And we also must respect them. If they don't want to talk, we should honor that to a certain degree. But keep in mind that when we ask questions, what is it we're doing? Are we badgering? Or are we caring? So if we care about what's happening with our kids, remind yourself, I'm caring. And there are other ways to care besides asking pointed questions. So if you want to care, then you need to think to yourself, well, okay, well, what can I do besides pepper my kids with questions? I can relate. I can share an experience. I can share what I do. And the kids would say, yeah, but Mom, you listen to that old school stuff.
That's fabulous. Yeah, makes a world of sense. I
Yeah.
think Sister Bettina has her hand up. Sister Bettina, would you like to go ahead and speak? Oh,
Well,
and
hi.
that is Dr. Tamra.
Yes, it is. I just want to thank Dr. Vereen for this amazing conversation on mental health because he brought up some very, very important points. And that is that, first of all, like he talked about, the family structure is one of the most poignant protective factors in identifying adolescent mental health. And I think that once we begin to continue having conversations like this around mental health, and I like to consider mental health a spectrum of wellness to illness. And once we begin to have
Amen.
about where wellness is and what illness looks like in our communities, especially African American communities, then we could begin to see a risk reduction in adolescent mental health. And then considering social media and how huge that is in young people's lives, is so important that we began to talk about social media. I can understand that we want to limit it, but sometimes it's just not a realistic option. But using social media as a tool, a teachable tool, and talk about some of the things, because the access that these young people have is really incredible. And it's very fascinating how so many of them want to be influencers and all these things that they go through to try to, gain a certain status. So parents being aware of that, but also parents addressing their mental health. I mean, and normalizing the fact or naturalizing the fact that it's okay not to be okay. But what does that look like, right? And then what tools do we have in place? What self-care options do we have in place? Because when a parent's mental health is not there, the child's mental health is going to be very challenging to be there. And I know that it can be situational, it can be adjustment disorder, it can be all of these different types of things, maybe not necessarily inherited all the time, but it's so important to kind of understand the context and framing of which these things come from. And one thing that was also very important, and I really appreciate Dr. Vereen for saying, is that mental health begins far before that child is in this womb, in the world. It begins in the womb, and maternal health is very important. So that prenatal care, and then we can get into ancestral imprints and all those things that are passed down in the biochemical structure, the energetical structure. And so I just wanted to kind of just chime in and just say, thank you, Dr. Vereen, for having this conversation. It's so very important. And I hope we all take away the fact that mental health on the spectrum of wellness to illness is very important for all of us. And so the better we are, the more healthier we are, the healthier our children can be. And that was it. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
amen to that. Perfect relationship to the information I was trying to present, because what you just heard was a way to think about these important issues, and how to think about them and frame them. And that's really probably the most important thing that I could say. Let me make a reference to a question in the chat about childhood depression and the first signs of depression, and not just thinking that it will go away. My quick, and this is by no means the only aspect of the answer, but for most of our kids have access to pediatricians. And you don't have to wait for a child psychiatrist or something like that. You can take or mention to your pediatrician that you're concerned about depression in your child, and a conversation will start. Now, I could go through the signs and symptoms of depression, and I will in a future, if you would like, in a future discussion. However, in kids, and this is true of people, in their 80s and 90s, when they're depressed, they don't show the signs and symptoms in the same way. So any change in your kid's behavior, anything that may make you suspect that they might be depressed, would be important symptoms. And they're going to be different for each child. And the important thing there is to connect as soon as possible with the people and the system that is in the best position to offer you help. So that's going to be the pediatrician. The second thing I want to say about that connection is that don't be afraid of the diagnostic label that you may get from the pediatrician or whomever the pediatrician may send you to. The purpose of that diagnosis, even in this day of impersonal, sterile medical care, is it outlines a set of interventions that are supposed to work for that diagnosis. And that's what you want for your child. You want these choices of things that are going to go in and help you better understand what the mental illness is or what the mental health challenge is, and how to treat it or how to make it less of an issue. That's what the diagnosis does. We know there's stigma attached to these things, But again, just like the presentation today, it's knowledge and it's context.
Mhm.
And you need to use those things together. Use the knowledge of a diagnosis, the context of school and family and outside of those spheres to work together to help neutralize the brain disease of depression.
Wonderful, wonderful. So Dr. Verena, I've looked in the chat. We have a couple of questions/comments. One question was going back to what you mentioned earlier about genetic codes and all that, and how a child's mental health forms even in the womb. So the specific question is, are you saying that mental health is inherited? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, it is, and it isn't. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. You know what? I'm having too much. I'm not as fast at doing that.
That's okay.
When we say that something is genetic, it's almost never purely genetic.
Mm-hmm.
Your genes do not determine you. There are very few things that your genes determine, and even then it's indirect. Your genes are interacting with your environment. You can have a gene for something. Let's say you have a gene for depression, but you live in a family that is active, it's healthy, you're eating all the right things, you're in a school where you're able to achieve and you get good feedback. You may never express the genes for depression because your environment isn't allowing those genes to be expressed. That's why we talk about risk factors. Because if you're in an unhealthy environment, any genetic predispositions are going to show they're going to rear their ugly heads. Mm-hmm. So the environment can be protective. So that's the way to think about genetic predisposition. And I brought up that example to say many of us have genetic predispositions for things. The thing is, do we have access to health care? Do we have access to good health care so that when something goes wrong, we can get it treated? So that's the way to think about that. I make the point about genetic underpinnings, genetic predisposition, because it's true. That's biology. But it doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. All I'm saying is, let's not pretend it's not there. And if we do know about it, how do we think about it? Now, let me also be clear. There are white racist people who think that we are inferior. And they'd be the first to say, your genes make you inferior. Mm-hmm. No, they don't. They can predispose you, but those same genes that dispose Black people to depression, it exposes white people to depression too. We are no different in that sense. So people can weaponize knowledge and information. I'm presenting, it's a two-edged sword. You know, they used to sterilize Black women because they did not want any more Black children. They didn't want Black children who may have been presenting as depressed. They couldn't work in the cotton fields if they couldn't get up and out of bed and they didn't have the energy. So no, it's genes and the environment. Genes are only as good as their environment, is one way to think about it. They're only as good as their environment. Some genes are very strong. Some combinations of genes are very strong.
Mhm.
But as we're learning with cancer treatments now, once we understand the genetic basis of the cancer, they're using that to train your own immune system to go after that cancer as if it was the coronavirus.
Mm. Wow.
So
Wow.
that's genes are important and they're powerful, but they're not. No, the more we understand what they are and how they work, then we can overcome some of the negative things because the genes code for positive things too.
Mhm.
We never talk about the genetic basis for resiliency, do we?
No, no. And
How do
that's a
we
culture
know that
issue.
resiliency isn't inherited?
Yeah.
See, that's a question I know hasn't been answered, but it's been asked by so many African American and I would say Asian people that I've treated in the past.
Mm. So it sounds like culture. I know you mentioned environment,
Yes?
but to drill it down, it's really culture. And I think about it in the South here, and this is going to be our last comment because we're right at 11:57. But I think about how in the South we have families that down through the years, particularly in the faith-based community, will say, "Oh, well, they have um, a mental health issue in that family, or they have I'm going to say the word, they have a crazy gene. Here comes
Mm-hmm.
so and so. She's kin to so and so. They have a crazy gene." So it's really not that. It is environment, it is culture, and if they are perchance genetically predisposed, that environment and that culture pulls it out. So we as the church, as the Head Start, as the school,
Amen.
as the community, we need to do more to make sure that instead of um, um, doing things that perpetuate that gene, we need to make it better and create
Yes.
services and programs, which is what we try to do at Oak Hill Regional CDC. So
Yes.
thank you for
But I
helping us
but I
understand.
but I will add one other thing. We've
Uh-huh.
learned a lot about mental illness.
Yes.
And we can do a lot more than we used to. So if we take the issue, for example, like attention deficit disorder,
Hmm.
you can give these kids an amphetamine pill and it will help the vast majority of them like that.
Yeah.
But you could also put them in a smaller classroom,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is a challenge now because schools don't have the resources to have more classrooms with smaller numbers of kids.
Right.
And you get the same effect.
One-on-one attention, a little tender loving care.
There you go.
Absolutely.
The research says that both, when you're applying them together, work the best because the brains of kids with ADD, their brains are different. Their
Mm.
brains are, in fact, different.
Mm.
And so there's a biology there that we've learned. But we can affect that biology biologically or socially. And what works best is when you do both together. So if you have a genetic predisposition and you've got a good environment, the two of them together are going to be the best at dealing with that gene.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you. Last comment in the chat from Sister Bettina mentioned the role of spirituality.
Yes,
Spirituality, I know, can be a blanket term. The faith-based community, regardless of what that faith may be, can play a positive role in that and in helping that spirituality to grow, whatever our faith base is. That makes all the difference. And we see, because of individuals like you helping us to understand mental health, that churches and other houses of worship are better embracing mental health issues instead of keeping it taboo. I remember 3, 4, 5
absolutely.
years ago when we started talking about these subjects, in every conversation we talked about how in the church mental health is so taboo. But I think these last few years, particularly with the pandemic, we have learned, okay, this is not a hush hush subject. Let's put it on the forefront. and use our spirituality to help these folks get better. Prayer, meditation, whatever it is, it does work. You know?
I will absolutely, it does, and I'm agreeing, and I'm going to offer the following evidence.
Okay,
I didn't get to the slides
that's okay.
about well-being, and pleasure is the most primitive aspect of well-being. There's a biological basis for that. There is a part of our brain that puts the rest of the brain in a different mood, if you will, when it is moved spiritually. Fellowship comes close to what happens when you're with your family, when you're with your loved ones, when you are with friends. There are all kinds of biological things that happen, and we can actually watch it on a brain scan. That's, now, for those of us who are faithful, we don't necessarily need that proof. I'm saying that not only is that an important spiritual, cultural thing, it's also a biological thing. And I don't want us to forget about the biology. We have the ability to get our brains to think, move, and feel in the ways that we are supposed to. Most of the time, the ways we want to. And that's why we should embrace it.
Wonderful.
Because there's evidence that it works.
Oh yeah, there's definitely evidence. I know in our personal lives, and there's documented evidence. So that's why it's so important when dealing with our children to get them in that
for the doubting Thomases
early.
For the doubting Thomases out there.
Yes.
There's knowledge and there's a frame. Yes.
Get them in that environment early on. Start them out.
Amen.
Train up a child while he is young, and that's regardless of our faith tradition. Even if we are not of any faith tradition, that is a tried and true fact. Train them while they're young. Get them in that happy place. Thank you, Dr. Vereen. This has been fabulous. We are going to close out. This has been
wonderful. Thank you all.
You are such a wonderful presenter. You are just part of our team now. You've been with us so much. So this has been awesome. We thank you. We've learned a lot. We know that it is important for us to be aware of mental health issues in our children. It's important for us to practice behaviors that promote our mental well-being. We encourage our audience to share the information that you learned today. Share it on your social media pages so that people will be able to look at this in the future. This is good information. It doesn't expire. It doesn't spoil. So we can watch this anytime. Let's remember that on Monday, May 22nd at 6 p.m. Will be our Ask Mary and Pat Zoom webinar. So we ask everyone who's present to please join that. Our next Third Wednesday Parent Resource Chat is going to be June 21st. June 21st. And June is Men's Health Awareness Month. Not mental health, but Men's Health Awareness, which encompasses mind, body, spirit, all of it. So we want to focus on our men, making sure that our men are as healthy as they can be. Our speaker is going to be Dr. Kent Key, PhD from Michigan State University, Division of Public Health. Again, Dr. Vereen, thank you so much for helping us, for enlightening us, for giving us the information that we need. For all our viewers, we thank you for being with us today. You can learn more about us at www.oakhillregionalcdc.com and www.healthykidsmississippi.org. Once again, we acknowledge our board chair, Ms. Jennifer Garrett, and our executive director, Dr. Michael O. Miner. This has been a production of Oak Hill Regional Community Development Corporation, belonging, believing, and bridging in the Mid-South region and across the state of Mississippi. All right, thank you so much. hope that you have been helped by this. I know that I have. We are going to sign off of social media now. If our